In all my years of running and making role-playing game campaigns, creating half-cocked war games, and passively world building, there's one thing that fleshes out the world and makes everyone instantly engaged. Really nice butts. I mean, think about it. Everyone loves a nice butt. Even ace people with aesthetic attraction do. There's just something about it. But besides that, a close runner-up is factions. Everyone loves a good faction. A nice and neat little box they can put a bunch of people into and have a vague sense of who they are and what they're like. But when either you or your players twist your arm into making them, how do you do it? What's more important? That they're a well-rounded organization of interesting people or characters? Or their butts are well-rounded? All on this episode of Why Are You Talking About This? Nerd. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Waytad Nerd. Holy shit, it feels good to be back. We got a little bit more of a simple episode for you today, but, hey, why not come back with something pretty light, easy, and nice? And I'll be your guide through your journey into organizations this week. But before we continue, it means the world to have you listening, especially if it's because you heard an ad for my show and decided to give me a listen before writing a one-star review. Don't worry, the brainworms are already in your head. You will be changing your review to 5 stars when the activation trigger sounds. But with that, I don't necessarily have updates to give, since I'm writing this mid-December, about 2 weeks before this episode comes out, and before my first ad comes out. So, listenership is still relatively low right now, and I haven't gotten any emails yet. However, I do just want to advise everyone to watch Win Koshika on Twitch. That is WYNKOSHIKA. If you like VTubers, which, I mean, you're listening to me, you'll love their streams. Make sure to be nice if you check them out, and you might even catch me in chat being down bad for Potionomics characters and making fun of fictional people's life choices. But with that, let's go to the show. Man, I really gotta stop doing spur of the moment shoutouts. One day not asking first is gonna bite me in the grundle. Anyways, we're gonna be talking about organizations. And just to warn you, it's not gonna be like other episodes. We're mostly gonna be doing advice and applications, since, I don't know about you, but the history of organizations sounds a bit, boring. And there's not a whole lot to, explain before we hit actual advice territory. So let's just start off with a classic definition. What is an organization? Put simply, it's an organized and coordinated group of people with a particular purpose. But that's way too broad to really be helpful for what we're talking about. See, with this, your cast of main characters would count as an organization. And I don't think you want to count those chuckle fucks. Especially because there's only 5 of them, 2 of them are hooking up, 2 of them are constantly fighting, and 4 of them have diagnosable edgelord disorder. Instead, organizations are usually a bit larger than that. Really anything with dozens or more people. Organizations are created to unify the efforts of and coordinate multiple people on the task at hand. So while your party isn't an organization, they could certainly be the center of it. Or, for example, with any society of sufficient size, you'll need organizations to spring up to deal with all the different day-to-day tasks that a large group needs done. Like communications, So you'd have a whole organization of people who drop what they were doing and go full time into communications and information brokering in order to handle that aspect of society. Because whenever you have a task and a large amount of people, forming an organization is a great way to deal with the task. Factions, on the other hand, are groups of allies with a unifying cause and goal that brought them together. In real life, you could call governments like the US, UK, Germany, and France organizations, or factions within themselves, but they form a faction called NATO. And like that example would imply, factions are usually defined a lot more by the conflict that brought them together than an organization is. Generally, an outside threat to their livelihoods or existence. And this can be as simple as a faction forming to survive a force of nature or conflict with a social or economic system, all the way to the complexity you'd get from a world war, galactic economy, or a competition for rare spell scrolls and arcane power. All of these can create factions. The other major difference between the two is the internal unity in these groups. Organizations tend to have much lower personal unification, but a lot of structural unity. Because organizations are meant to do a task, and why each member is there is different. For example, if your organization is a thieves guild, found because it's a lot easier to work together than kill each other over loot, each individual is there for their own reason. Maybe one is there because they like the aspects of honor and trust, even in a world filled with criminals. Another is there because the choices were join the thieves guild or get treated like a healthcare CEO. A third thought the only way to join the criminal underworld was to join the guild, and another guy is just there because he saw the leader and thought mommy and has been here ever since. Everyone has their own personalized reasons they follow the organization's rules. People would either turn jaded or leave if the organization no longer was viable for their reason. However, your faction of 7 kingdoms joining forces because the undead are rising from the west and threatening to bury them under a mountain of zombies has a lot of personal unity and loyalty, but are less structurally unified. They present a strong face because the reason why factions form are out of a sense of survival or community against a threat or conflict. And you could even mix and match. Why is the kingdom of Alverta involved? Well, because of the zombies invade there first. And Lorenz on the other side of the continent? Well, because if the zombies invade, then their cultural siblings will be killed. Also, watch Lorenz, that's edging on some, eugenics-y kind of talk. But anyways, that's the real difference. In every other way, these groupings are pretty similar, if not essentially the same. It's just important to have that distinction because it'll help you figure out some of the structuring questions we have later. But with that, let's talk about why this matters before I tell you how you should do it. Alright, so why it matters to make good organizations, like most things, comes down to the good side and the bad side. Because it's more engaging and a lot easier, we'll start with the negativity. Poorly done organizations and factions run the gamut from being boring all the way to being incredibly problematic. On the boring end, if your factions aren't even enraging, then your audience will be entirely uninterested in what's going on and basically anything to do with them, which is arguably one of the worst fates of any piece of writing. People won't even engage with it. Most commonly, these factions just end up frustrating, and your audience begins to think everyone in the world is fucking stupid. This is usually how people feel about, Fallout 4's factions. A combination of having very little in-game impact and reliance on the player character, combined with some of their actions, leaves some people walking away thinking, wow, that was fucking dumb. If you've played Fallout 4 and have one in mind, you're who I'm talking about. But that doesn't even touch on the problematic end. Let's say that you create a faction of elves that have lost a good number of wars in a row and have been shit on despite being one of the core powers in their region for almost a millennia. So, in their pettiness and angst, they decide that only full-blooded elves are worthy of life, and that humans, dwarves, and orcs are ruining the culture of the region. and let's say they wear snazzy black uniforms and really love predatory raptors, well, I mean, now your audience, justifiably, is thinking, wow, that's a funny way to spell Nazi. And say you made the mistake of being like, and guess what? They were right. Well, now you're doing that thing again that we talk about all the time. Don't base your fictional factions, even the villains, on real-world evil or fucked up factions or organizations, because the moment there's something that looks redeemable about them, people will assume you mean the real-world faction too. Now, what about well-made factions? Well, those can be very interesting and engaging to your audience. Having a well-designed, understandable, clearly defined organization or faction can draw your audience in. Because sure, in real life, factions are a bit more dynamic, it feels realistic to portray them as pretty distinct. A good faction can not only engage the audience you already have, but draw in new people as well. For example, amongst the wargaming community, there's a reason why Games Workshop games are popular. And let me tell you, it's not the fucking rules, or the prices, or how the company is run. It's because its lore is engaging, factions are interesting, and minis are iconic and fun to build to paint. All of these factors are extremely important in their popularity, and it all stems from each faction feeling largely unique with their own identities and backstories. Now, do other games have this? Yes, but if, for example, you approach a set of tables, one of them is playing Bolt Action, one of them is playing Age of Sigmar, and one playing Conquest Last Argument of Kings, whose factions look the most different between each other? But beyond drawing an audience in, they become an easy crutch for you to use in your writing. Say, for example, you have your back against the wall and the hero might die. Well, it's time for Deus Ex Machina. If you don't have your factions at least written out and identities figured out yet, you might pull something entirely out of your ass. But lucky for you, you listen to your best friend at WayTat. So, you look at your faction list, and look at that. You're super stealthy, totally not just your first D&D character made into a faction. Night Elves hate the Orc clan that currently has your character in the middle of BDSM night at the retirement home without a paddle. Don't think about that. So you send a group of Night Elf assassins in, and they murderize the Orcs for you. And because it's already established in lore, it's kind of out of nowhere, but not complete bullshit. Which your audience will like. So, now let's get into the meat. Okay, so because I have a lot of personal experience in this field, we're actually going to start with my own personal advice on how I make organizations. Because I've been doing it for a very long time, and I have a few different ways I like to do it. The first way, and by far the simpler way to do it, is that I search my mental catalog of all the fiction I like, look for a fictional setting or settings that generally match the vibes of what I'm going for. So for example, if I'm creating a grimdark story or a game, I'll usually take a look at 40k or something along those lines. And from there, I'll take a number of their factions that I like the vibe of, and translate them to make more sense in the universe I'm building. Say, for example, that I'm making a grimdark setting surrounding humanity after the fall of its massive star-spanning empire, where everyone is just absolutely motherfucked and just running down the doomsday clock. Well, that sounds like the Imperium. And since it's human-focused, I have all the factions I need. Ignoring Knights and Titans because they don't fit, I have a good number of factions to work with still. And say I decide to plug the Space Marines in. Now, given that 1, I'm not a total hack, and 2, James Workshop is about as litigious as Disney and about as smart as EA, I can't just lift it entirely. So they're super soldiers, yes, but instead of protectors of humanity, they're the last remnants of the old guard of humanity that have become almost entirely bent to warfare and trying to reclaim the old empire. And a lot of Space Marine stuff already works with that. So we just do an armor redesign, change their chapters and primarchs to philosophical differences in leadership, and cover them in patina of hopelessness, rust, shit, piss, blood, and cum, and there you go. The Remnant. Rinse and repeat until I'm out of useful factions in the setting I love, and then there we go. World created. Now, obviously, change names, methodology, and stuff like that, but that gives you a good baseline. When it comes up, then you can ask questions about your particular faction instead of the faction in canon. Like in 40k, the Mechanicus supplies everybody. But in this totally distinct Grimdark, they're an oppositional faction that has merged with an AI hive mind and are a religion and cocaine-fueled idea that that's the best way for humanity to survive. So if the Cult of the Sacred Binary and the Remnant interacted, it wouldn't be the 40k, I think your beliefs are stupid, but I work with you because I need bolter shells, but instead would be outright hostility, as the Remnant wants to recreate humanity as it was, and not a bunch of cyborgs and H.R. Geiger monstrosities. Now, my other more difficult method actually uses a D&D book. Because, see, many moons ago, I got a book called Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. And that made me fall in love with the process of making factions they presented. That essentially you can plug and play any number of the Ravnica factions into your setting by stripping away the name and looking at their roles. And since then, I've done an extra step and pared it down even more. So now I use categories of organizations and fields of labor all societies address or need to address to be filled out as well. To be filled out well. And I use these to forge factions by combining the responsibilities and traits together into different groups. And these would be law enforcement, lawmakers, the justice system, communications and media, espionage, pink-collar services, blue-collar labor, forestry and wildkeeping, conservationism, environmentalism, charities, religious orders, banking and the economy, physical sciences, engineering, agriculture, waste management, military, life sciences, and medicine. And from that list, you can make just about any organization that you can imagine. So to show some of the process, let's make 2 organizations with 3 of the above responsibilities at random. So, after determining that, the first one represents the physical sciences, law enforcement, and the military. Starting off strong, and totally not evil. So this organization not only acts as cops, but also soldiers, and also studies and implements things like physics, chemistry, and astronomy. Which sounds like it's one part sci-fi military research organization, and one part actual military branch. So let's go with that. Why do they have these roles? Well, let's just make it simple and say they started off as scientists and researchers, but their chemicals and materials became very useful to law enforcement. So much so that law enforcement was handed over to them, or they bought out all the law enforcement agencies. And after some insanely lethal discoveries, their military contracts slowly morphed into recruiting their pick of soldiers, managing training, and issuing equipment. So this organization is an organization of militant scientists that test new weaponry and law enforcement, then streamline it and jack up the lethality to arm their soldiers. Yikes. But also interesting for a story, especially as antagonists. So let's call it Canaanite Labs, because I am, after all, a hack. Okay, and the second one controls conservationism and environmentalism, life sciences, and blue-collar labor. Which is actually easier than the... Sorry, the train has opinions. Which is actually easier than the last one. It could literally be an organization of rangers and wildlife researchers that got merged with an organization that performs medical research, biological study, epidemiology, and biochemistry. And over time, as the organization became more and more influential and controlled more and more, their control over environmental manufacturing regulations turned them into just controlling the majority of the blue collar sector to maintain. And over time, as the organization became more and more influential and controlled more and more, their control over environmental manufacturing regulations turned into them just controlling the majority of the blue-collar sector to maintain direct control. Which sounds like I'm describing the boogeyman of about a quarter of all people who voted for Donald Trump, and is strangely and possibly sexually attracted to their coal-rolling pedestrian smearing pickup truck. But this organization doesn't sound like it have a lot of teeth in lore. Maybe more as a background element or world building, so let's just call them the Organized Craftsfolk Union of the National Territories. Abbreviate at your own risk. Okay, but given I'm just a random asshole on the internet that you hate listening to, or that you've listened to most of my other episodes, and you know that even when I know what I'm talking about, I'm still not trustworthy, let's look at some other advice from around the internet. Beginning with Matthew A. Olson of... I misspelled that. Beginning with Matthew A. Olson of Chaotic Writer. For him, the first step is ask why your faction was organized in the first place. And he gives 8 samples of what you could pick. There's military, religious, political, economic, guild or workers' union, cultural identity, a shared figurehead, or criminal unity. Now, he does point out that most factions in the real world and well-designed fictional ones will have multiple facets, especially ones that are really large or detailed, like your wargame faction. That really only needs a military aspect, but the world building can be that they came from a religious movement or a figurehead. Once you have that figured out, determine their name. This would be their official name, but also any shorthands or nicknames that get used for them. And that feels hard, that's because it is. So, ask some of these questions to jog an idea. What binds them together? What's their symbols? Do outsiders use nicknames? And if so, are these nicknames immediately identifiable to the group they're talking about? And is this term something insulting or endearing? Alright, so now that we have that, let's go to the next step. Figuring out their goals and motivations. So, like, what's the overall mission? What are they seeking to change? What's the reason for the mission? Are they in it for themselves or others? And does it depend on which member you talk to? Do outsiders see it differently? And this can be hopeful or hopeless as you want. Maybe their goal is to finally end the world because they're tired of reality and just want it to end. Or maybe they're trying to make the entire world better and save everyone. But next, you're going to want to look at the organizational structure. This will give them a general vibe for how they operate and help you organize them in their actions. Stuff like their ranks, what roles do they care about and fill, who is their leader and how do they represent them, what concepts unify the group, how does the faction get their supplies and how they control the quality of their supplies, what is the ruling body and who's in charge, and what is the basis of their ranking system, and how do you gain more power in the organization. Then you're going to want to figure out their conflicts, since most factions are developed from conflict. So who are their rivals? What separates them from outsiders? What stands in the way of their goals? And do these goals come in conflict with other goals or outsiders? What's their relationship to other organizations and neutral parties? And what's their relationship with rival organizations and groups? Which will then lead you directly into their history and reputation. Where'd they come from? Where'd they go? Is their name Cotton Eye Joe? How they first unify and how they get here? What challenges have they encountered to make it to the modern day? What's the story that they tell about themselves, and what's the story other people tell about them? And how does the faction look at different phases of its lifespan and where it's heading? And does that history influence the present? And for reputational questions, what kind of reputation do they have and why? And what do their own members think of the faction compared to outsiders and enemies? And then finally, gotta add some personality and culture. What are their traditions? What kind of logos and mottos do they use? What's their symbols and why do they use them? What are their colors? Do they have songs? What do they do for fun? And where are they based? What's the age range of recruits and members? And what's admirable? And what are admirable traits? What'll get you kicked out or executed? And if you answer, I'm not going to say all, but if you answer a bit of those questions, you'll get a pretty good framework for a faction. Although Olson does have some procedural advice to keep in mind while answering these questions. Firstly is that factions don't come about in a bubble. If you have one, there's probably bigger conflict brewing already happening. Conflict and cooperation builds cultures, societies, and factions. And it's worthwhile to put this effort in because they serve as a great background for character conflict and adds a large scope to the conflict between heroes and villains. It's also a good idea to take some inspiration and references from other fictional and historic factions. Of course, be careful doing this so you don't create accidental Nazis. Use it more to explore how big organizations can get, the logistics, and some help narrowing down on all of these on how all these cogs interact. And also keep in mind something that most people wouldn't even consider. Factions aren't a setting. They're a character in their own right. Use them like that, but with a million tiny parts. At least in your narrative structure and plot, not like in a hive mind, single action purpose kind of way. If you want a villainous faction included in your story, make them do things villains would do, but on a larger scale. Or if you want a faction that kind of just rolls up and fucks everyone up, imagine them as a character or monster that does that. Now for the last section of advice, we're going to go over to RM Archer on Scribes and Archers. And she breaks it down into 6 steps. The first step is to identify your faction's core purpose. Basically, think about all of the things that hold it together and justifies its existence while distinguishing it from other factions. And you can't have multiple. In fact, it's probably a good idea to have more than one. But if you're really going to go bare bones, go for 3. Their public purpose, their private purpose, and their narrative purpose. The public purpose is what they tell people they're doing. Like my Space Marine insert saying that they're there to restore humanity to what it once was. The private purpose is what the organization's real goal is. And while yes, this is usually nefarious, it doesn't have to be. Like how most companies have the public purpose of serving the community or providing jobs, the true intent and purpose at the heart of it is to make money. Basically, just think of the purpose that they don't advertise. Like our Mace Marines, really just having no idea what the fuck to do, so they invade worlds and kill people because it's been working, so something has to be going right. And the narrative purpose is why they're even in the story in the first place. Stuff like minions, deuteragonists, exposition dumps, surprise allies, nutsack drainers, stuff like that. The second, develop an overarching structure. Think about who founded it and what their motives were. Who succeeded them and changed it up or failed to change it. Consider how hierarchy and progression works and what the structure of leadership is. Groups focused on a common interest don't necessarily have a single leader or need an iron fist to lead them. While a large-scale group or one with a big footprint probably needs multiple levels of leadership and rules. So it'll give a lot of identity and help you navigate them around if you have this in place. Third, think about what the membership requirements are. What skills do you need? What's the cost? Are there dues or pledges you have to make? How do you stay in the organization and contribute things? Do you need to act? How do you need to act, and how do you show your loyalty? Also, what restrictions are there on becoming a member? All this allows for the faction to be a lot more unified and also lets you see the pros and cons of different structures. Like if you decide all you need to do is say you're part of the group and headquarters gives you the thumbs up and no oversight, then you also can't have them all be the same motherfucker but wearing different hats. I mean, unless they're all clones, but that's neither here nor there. They're going to have a lot of autonomy and personality. That's all I'm saying. While one with a lot of oversight, yearly dues, pledges of loyalty, ranks, and concrete roles will not have much individual personality, but can more easily do things in an organized group. Fourth, think about how they increase in number. Do they do some good old-fashioned fucking? Do they bring in non-members? Do people come to them, or do they come to people? Nice. Also, what are they even looking for in members? Do you need to pass a test, have another member say you're chill like that, or do your pants have to slip one past the goalie? And once you're in, is there a celebration? All this, again, gives more culture to the group and can help you figure out the size. Also, can you leave? Is it possible? Or is it so technically impossible that no one really leaves? Then think over traditions and functions. How they go about ceremonies. Do they have a weekly team meeting like it's corporate America? How's their leadership lead and what's their command style? How do they value people? What's their style? What gets rewarded and what things or behaviors are most prized? Because all of this, besides fighting the conflict, gives your organization stuff to do. Because think, when you abandon an organization pretty fast and never actually did anything? Because at that point, if you just sign some paperwork and you're technically a member, but you get no benefits and nothing changes, then you're not a faction. You're in my grade school's tag program. If you only show up for competitions or battle, you're just a part of a men's over 40 volleyball league. So you need goals. And finally, include subgroups and cliques. Because this is something that happens in the real world pretty often. Any substantially large group, i.e. more than 3 members, will have their own subgroups, especially massive organizations spanning the world or an entire empire. So make sure that they have subgroups. You don't have to super flesh them out, but make sure they pass the test of being lightly passed over by your audience. Alright, let's end the episode. Alright, so hopefully now you're able to make your own organization without any accidental Nazis. Or purposeful ones, for the love of God, please. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, your own homebrew organizations, telling me where I can stick my opinions with diagrams and demonstrations, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That is waytatpods@gmail.com. Remember, check out my other podcast, Waytat, where I do basically the same thing, but with a bunch of fucked up real world stuff. Yay! And also remember to follow me on Blue Sky and Twitter at waytat_pods for more episode announcements and occasional shitposts. Have a good night, don't murder, have fun, and remember, you can start any club you want to if you psychosis your way into friends. This has been Why You're Talking About This Nerd. I've been your host, William. Good night.